I'm Tasha Halevi, and this is Footprint Radio. Living in the city is the new green, and today we'll discuss sustainable urbanism and how to live in the city with a sustainable twist. One of our guests today is Julie Hauser. Julie is the owner and design mind behind Indigo Landscape Design. She has studied with the Permaculture Institute and will discuss how permaculture fits into the urban context. And later, BGBG member Rois Langner will share a green building tip for gardening in the city. But first, Doug Farr will share his expertise in sustainable urbanism. Doug is on the board of the Congress for New Urbanism, a member of the LEAD Steering Committee, and was the inaugural chair of the LEAD for Neighborhood Developments Committee. Doug is the founder of the 2030 Community Challenge and author of Sustainable Urbanism, Urban Design with Nature. Doug is the founding principal and president of Farr & Associates. This is the Boulder Green Building Guild's Footprint Radio on KGNU Boulder, KGNU Denver. Doug, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
In your book, Sustainable Urbanism, Designing with Nature, you define sustainable urbanism as walkable and transit-served urbanism integrated with high-performance buildings and high-performance infrastructure. Can you further discuss the core values and essential elements of sustainable urbanism?
Thanks for the question. You're asking about the core values, and the definition you've read is one that is useful to a professional audience of planners and architects, even mayors and city council representatives, because it's concerned with sort of the policy and the rules and the building end of our communities. People think about things and make decisions using two really different sets of tools, and that definition appeals to the rationalist in our brain, but we also have, I think, an equal measure of emotional, where we like something, we see it, we like it, we want it. The complementary definition and core values that goes with that very technical definition is simply that people should like the places where they inhabit, where they live, work, and play, and they should like them enough to not always want to leave them. In terms of core values of sustainable urbanism, it is about making lovely, lovable places so well designed that you'll live your life in a place and meet your daily needs, ideally on foot.
We're all becoming familiar with the term high-performance buildings and can easily establish the responsible parties who play a role in creating this. But what is high-performance infrastructure, and how do we determine who is responsible for implementing this infrastructure?
So in writing Sustainable Urbanism, one of the things we had to undertake was research on the history of infrastructure, sort of where did it come from, what was the timing of the arrival of infrastructure in a place. And we came across a really surprising to us insight, which was human settlements usually took place in the absence of infrastructure. People chose a place because it was auspicious. Infrastructure in virtually every case came later. Infrastructure is sort of after the fact and seems to be motivated by one of two primary motives. One is to convey away a waste product, and the classic ones here are, our sewage treatment systems and our solid waste removal systems, basically garbage pickup. And then the kind of unintended cousin to all that is treating stormwater as a waste product and also feeling the need to quickly convey it away. But all of those things tended to be retrofitted into existing settled places. And so it's hard for infrastructure conceived to simply convey away a waste product to be thought of as high performance. So high performance infrastructure is a pleasant one to talk about to an audience familiar with Boulder, Colorado, because Boulder, as your listeners I'm sure know, has been chosen, I think it's the only city in the U.S. to be chosen to get an investment of a smart grid technology, which recognizes the fact that with new higher performance buildings that themselves will generate some portion, maybe even the lion's share of their own power needs in the form of electricity from photovoltaic and wind, that the electrical grid now has to be smart. It has to go both ways. It's not just conveying electrons from a central location to be consumed out, at the periphery. It can go both ways, and so that's a really sort of prime example of high-performance infrastructure. We'll see a lot more high-performance infrastructure in the years to come that creates a lot more value. There's economics behind this.
Speaking of Boulder, Colorado, in your book you discuss Boulder, Colorado's Holiday Neighborhood. Can you explain how this project addresses key sustainable urbanism thresholds?
What attracted us to it, to meet the threshold of including it amongst 19 other world case studies was the combination of green, which you see certainly in the infrastructure. There's an emphasis on stormwater, on green buildings and energy-efficient buildings. And there's also a social mission with some affordable housing, some co-housing as well. And obviously its location is a worthy one for settlement. I think it used to be the old Holiday Drive-In, as I recall. And so it's what we call an infill site. It's not on greenfield land. It's on a previously developed location. So those together created a critical mass for us. And I think what the 20 case studies that we included in the back of Sustainable Urbanism, each we chose them to try and tell a separate story. And the story told by Holiday Neighborhood was that you don't have to be super fancy in this stuff, and that a lot of people can collaborate and build adjacent parts of a project. So the affordable housing was on one block, and the co-housing was on the next block, and some market rate was down the way. But someone planned the entire development or neighborhood to function as a whole, and so each individual contributor contributed to their strengths, and the whole was greater than the sum of the parts.
And the master plan of the Holiday Neighborhood includes a park that serves as a stormwater management treatment as well. Can you discuss dual-purpose spaces?
Sure. Dual-purpose spaces like a stormwater park are an example of high-performance infrastructure. And what's interesting about them, when you go back to the definition of sustainable urbanism, it's high-performance infrastructure integrated with walkable urbanism and high-performance buildings. Integrated with is the verb here. And so what that means to me is that these are not things that are simply next to each other or adjacent or in the same vicinity. No, they are interdependent. And so the park and its ability to do stormwater in some ways allows the adjacent development to take place without causing environmental degradation. I'm very hopeful about all this stuff, is that we will begin to retrain both our professionals, our elected officials, and our staff to realize that the real way to get to sustainability is not by buying more and more efficient widgets in very narrow categories, but by taking a broader view and looking for the multiple benefits of everything you might do.
Doug, you use time to distance as a different way to look at scale of our environment. Where human scale is easily defined in design, this time to distance scale can easily vary from one city or neighborhood to the next. How do you implement this metric to fit cities as different as New York to LA to Boulder, Colorado, when it comes to time to distance?
What you're getting at with your question, which is a wonderful question, is the idea to me that there's a psychology of a place and with it a propensity for people to walk or choose different modes of transit. For example, the common wisdom, and this is good, in North America is that the most walkable city or section of a city, surprisingly not Manhattan, but is Vancouver, BC. And people will walk up to something like 1.25 miles in their daily routine to get to another place and not even elect to ride a bike or take transit. And so that's phenomenal. The mild climate like Vancouver, Seattle, Portland, and many other sections of the country are places which, lend themselves to walking year-round. So those places tend to have more of a walking culture and the distances are greater. I think Boulder and Denver, I actually think is a year-round walking climate. You have the virtue of sunny days, many sunny days. When it is cold, it is clear and cold. I think that the distances, in and around Denver and Boulder can be on the longer end, unlike, the Sun Belt. The second point I want to make here was that the sort of techniques of learning what it takes to urge a citizen or a family or a neighborhood or a population to move from every trip in a car to other modes and more walking and more biking is an emerging science and an art. And your question, speaks to the art end.
Here in Colorado and across the United States, we have some excellent examples of sustainable urbanism going into practice by following paradigms similar to those outlined in your book. However, even though they're following the rules, they seem to be a node without a connection. If you create a node that isn't yet connected, are you paving the way for sustainable urbanism or are you defeating the purpose?
Well, this raises the question of what a lot of projects choose to define themselves as transit-ready. So your question poses this idea that, within the boundaries of the development, it seems to be doing everything right. It's doing stormwater and green buildings and so on, but it's still in an isolated location, not served by transit. And so is that progress or is that a step backwards is a legitimate question. What I would say is the provision of transit in this country lags the demand by almost a generation. And so, and that's a tragedy, and there are a lot of reasons for it, not the least of which is our federal transportation bill funds roads, spends 80% of its transportation dollars on roads and only 20% on transit. So that's one thing. But for those projects that are not served by transit today, I have a number of tests I want to apply to them, which is, are you in a place where transit is planned? Okay? So, but that gets into another whole debate because there's a lot of planning maps circulating around the country where some planner somewhere drew a line out into the middle of nowhere and it says planned transit. And a lot of developers say, see, I told you transit's coming here someday, maybe. But in truth, not all lines drawn on the map are equal. And so I have come to the belief that the isolated project, untethered to transit, is probably a step backwards in most every case, but there are a few exceptions.
And this brings us to the concept of transit-oriented development. And TODs are pointedly developed to reduce vehicle miles traveled, or VMTs. Are TOD neighborhoods proving to be successful and usable?
Absolutely. First of all, TODs are thought of as new things, and maybe in the Denver area they are. But let's remind ourselves that they're based on places that have been in existence for 100, 150 years. I'm based in Chicago. Chicago and its neighborhoods and its near-in suburbs were developed around transit at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, and they are the places in our region which have retained their real estate value more than any others. Why? They offer quite a lot of choice to people. So in many of these places, you can probably live without a car altogether if you wanted to, or the more common demographic we see is that a family has one car less than they would if they lived in another location. And so, the cost of keeping a car on the road, even, with fluctuating gas, is something like $8,000 a year. And so if a family can go from 3 cars to 2 or 2 cars to 1 because they live in a transit-served neighborhood, that's quite a lot of wealth. Again, there's an undersupply of transit in the country. There's an undersupply of transit-oriented development in the country. And I think that the light bulb went off about 2 years ago that says we don't need any more detached single-family homes, and what we do need a lot more of are these urban transit-served walkable places integrated with green buildings.
You're behind the creation of the 2030 Community Challenge that complements Ed Masria's 2030 Challenge. What exactly is the 2030 Community Challenge, and how do you propose the goals be met?
So Ed Masria is just a hero of mine, an architect from the Southwest who was a really great leader in the solar energy movement in the 70s. And he has had a full second career in conceiving of and now promoting something he calls the 2030 Architecture Challenge. And that is this simple idea that buildings can sign up to meet this challenge he's set forth. And the challenge consists of buildings being designed to increasing levels of energy efficiency with the end game being that by 2030, all buildings designed under this protocol are zero net energy or carbon neutral. And so that, to me, was an inspiring example, and it really has caught, I think, the green building community, caught fire there. The 2030 community, we've renamed it the 2030 Community Campaign, was initially modeled after that and posed the question, can we also set numeric targets for reductions in driving that businesses or communities or municipalities might adopt as guidance for their investments and conduct and policies. And we have, it was adopted in whole cloth by the Congress for New Urbanism. It's number one, buildings are easier things for people to sign a pledge on. Why? They don't change your lifestyle. They don't ask you to change your conduct in any way. What we found was that people had cannot wrap their mind around the idea that the future might involve driving fewer miles. A lot of people whose job it isn't to be thinking about sustainability and reducing carbon footprints and reducing imported oil and things like that, I think they have a sort of space in their mind that says, you know what, I think efficiency is going to solve that for us. That I don't want to begin to think about what my life would be like if I drove less, because maybe I'll just be getting a Prius in a couple years. So we have really moved away from a numeric campaign initially towards more of a change the culture, change the thinking, rethink our lives sort of campaign. And it is focused again on where we started this conversation about places and living your life locally. Rather than being sort of punitive and saying hit these numbers, we are much more thinking about it in terms of visualize your life driving half the miles you do now. Imagine, like, how would your life be different? How might it even be better? Or what adjustments would you have to or would you like to make in your life to accommodate reduced driving? Because efficiency won't get us there.
We're speaking with Doug Farr. Doug, thank you for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
We often think of urban living as giving into the concrete jungle. Our next guest, Julie Hauser, will discuss how to integrate multifunctional vegetation into urban living by using ideals from permaculture. I asked Julie about the origins of permaculture. Bill Mollison and David Holmgren coined the term permaculture as a combination of permanent agriculture, which later morphed into permanent culture as well. Can you explain the significance of permanent agriculture and culture in the current definition of permaculture?
So permaculture is loosely defined as a lifestyle philosophy. Modern permaculture is a system design tool for ecological sustainability in all aspects of human existence. It teaches us how to build natural homes, grow our own food, restore diminished landscapes and ecosystems, catch rainwater, build communities, and a lot more. It's a way of looking at a whole system or problem and seeing the connections between the key elements and observing how these parts relate, then planning to mend sick systems by applying ideas learned from long-term sustainable working systems.
This is something that we talk about often with sustainable urbanism as well, and that is the concept of having dual spaces, dual purpose spaces, and that redundant use concept seems to be something that permaculture also embraces. Can you explain what the redundant uses are in permaculture?
Yeah, so the idea is one element needs to have many functions. And generally what they say is that it should have at least 3 functions. The classic example is the chicken, which if you've heard of permaculture, most people will quote the chicken. The chicken has many uses. And the other idea that's maybe a little bit more usable or more practical, shall we say, in our environment, like an urban environment, that many people have are arbors. So arbors provide shade for us in sunny locations. They provide a vertical growing area, so you can grow any type of vine. You can grow vegetables up at an arbor. And they also provide wildlife habitat. So that's 3 functions that an arbor provides for us. So it's always stacking functions. You're looking at how can you, out of one element, maximize what it can provide for you, and therefore reducing down the space that you're using and your consumption.
Another question that I think a lot of us have is related to the way people think of permaculture when they hear it. And permaculture is often pigeonholed as a hippie movement, but how can it play a more refined role in the urban context?
It has been defined as a hippie movement, but I think that in light of the nature of the way that our economy is going, there's definitely, and a new outlook on growing food or providing for yourself at your own home place. There's the local movements that are going on. There's the farmers markets. I think that with permaculture, there's a lot of things that we can provide for ourselves on our own home place. And we can with greenhouses, with creating microclimates, with, having neighbors that are willing to provide for each other. So, you're having one crop grown over here, another neighbor is growing a fruit crop, and you're sharing with each other. So we're providing for each other. And I think that that's more attractive. It creates community. Everything is getting increasingly more expensive. So the more that we can do locally for ourselves, it's going to improve our standard of living, the quality of life. It's going to improve the community and the connection that community has.
From your explanation, we can sort of see how someone who owns a home and has a little bit of land can work with permaculture, particularly by linking into the community with their neighbor. Do you see the same opportunities for somebody with a much smaller space, maybe somebody who lives in a 450 square foot apartment, but maybe has a little bit of room to grow something on the front porch? What are the opportunities there for permaculture?
Yeah, certainly. You can do permaculture on, the deck of your condo in a large city. You can do permaculture just about anywhere. And some of those smaller spaces where you are trying to provide for yourself are some of the places that you find the most innovative systems. Definitely, on the deck of a condominium, there's lots of vertical growing space. And if you're just one person or even two people in a unit, then there's no reason to have 10 tomato plants. You just need one. And you only need a window box to do that. And you can provide yourself with food.
If you live urban and just don't have the space for a garden, there may still be options for you. BGBG member Rois Langner presents this week's Green Tip on community gardens.
Last year I lived in an apartment where I didn't have space for a garden. After looking into community garden space, I applied for a plot of land with Boulder's Growing Gardens. Growing Gardens is Boulder's community garden network with 8 locations throughout the city available for yearly rental to gardeners. Not only is this a great way for those of us who don't have space for a garden at home to experience gardening and a connection with plants and land, but it's also a great way to participate in the garden community and experience a connection with each other. Many cities offer similar programs, and there are community gardens in almost every state. You can log on to the American Community Garden Association at www.communitygarden.org and search for a community garden in your area by clicking on Connect and putting in your zip code. Check out the American Community Garden Association webpage for more information. This is the BGBG Green Tip. I'm Rois Langner.
Thank you for joining us today on KGNU Boulder, KGNU Denver with Boulder Green Building Guild's Footprint Radio. You can podcast this show and learn more about the BGBG by going to bgbg.org. To share your green tip on the air, submit your ideas to radio@bgbg.org or go to the Footprint Radio tab on the BGBG website and submit with our online form. Thank you to our sponsors at Architectural Energy Corporation for taking a step towards greener footprints. I'm Tasha Halevi. This is Footprint Radio.